Okay, if you are all ready, we'll get started. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, a little clapping. Shall we get started? You ready? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so my name is Rosarie Tucci, and I'm here at USIP on the Inclusive Societies team, and I'm excited to be here with my colleagues, who I will introduce in just a minute, to talk about women's role in nonviolent movements. And it's a particularly timely moment to talk about these issues, because I do feel like the headlines are peppered with people power, which Maria can tell us more about, just about every day. Whether it's Nicaragua, Armenia, Venezuela, Maria's being tapped every other day to talk about these issues. It's also a particularly interesting time because in the field that we're in, peace building, we're looking at how to shift from conflict resolution to conflict transformation and sustaining peace. How do you keep the peace? And so what that means is it's less about how to just end the violence and more about how to really think about what the grievances are in society and how to address the root causes of conflict. So that's kind of the shift that you're seeing in our field, and we'll talk about how movements is critical to that shift. So again, how we look, and when we're looking at how to sustain peace and how to address structural inequalities and social injustice, the role of women is critical in moving this agenda forward. So I'm going to welcome my colleagues, Maria, let's see if we can get that straight throughout the session, and we're going to go by Lola. And so let me tell you just a little bit about each of these colleagues, and then they'll tell you a little bit about their own stories. Marie Berry, she's an associate professor of international comparative politics at the Korbel School of International Studies at Denver University. And she focuses on mass violence, gender, politics, and development. And we'll hear more about some of the work that she's conducting at Denver University. Lola is the executive director of Act for Accountability, which is an African diaspora organization committed to building a culture of accountability through civic action. And we'll hear more about her engagement in the Bring Back Our Girls movement. And we welcome our very own USIP expert, Maria Stephan, who directs the program on nonviolent action here at the Institute. She's a co-author of the book, Why Civil Resistance Matters. And she, like I said, she's been writing extensively on nonviolent action occurring around the world. So we're going to dive right in to questions. And please, ladies, if I ask a question and one of you wants to chime in and add something, please feel free to. So the first question, Maria, is for you. Thank you for your innovative work on how to understanding how nonviolent action supports sustainable peace. Based on your research, can you tell us more about what makes movements more successful? Nonviolent discipline, participation, and other components of success such as solidarity and planning. And what do women bring to the movements? What is lost if women are not part of movements?
Well, thanks very much, Ro, for the intros and for facilitating this morning's conversation. I can't think of a better topic than women in nonviolent movements, especially with a room full of women from across the country who are very engaged in various social political matters. So it's wonderful to be with you all today. So as Ro mentioned, I do work on nonviolent movements and civil resistance. So basically what civil resistance is a way for ordinary people to fight injustices and to advance human rights, freedoms, using active nonviolent means. So when we're talking about movements, this is how loose networks, coalitions, individuals come together and use collective action to bring about change. And the point is to do that actively but without violence or the threat of violence. Ro asked, why do nonviolent movements succeed? When does civil resistance work? So what we know through a study that I conducted with a fellow political scientist, Erica Chenoweth, a few years back, when we collected data on about 330 violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. So these were major political campaigns targeting authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, foreign military occupations. We found that the nonviolent campaigns succeeded twice as often as the violent campaigns, which was somewhat counterintuitive a few years ago. So the research, which culminated in a book, Why Civil Resistance Works, found that basically the reason why nonviolent campaigns have been so much more effective than violence over the course of history is that nonviolent movements tend to attract significantly higher numbers of participants from any given society. They attract more participants and from more diverse parts of any society. So this links to the second part, well, what about women? Well, women's participation in nonviolent campaigns and movements is absolutely critical, first and foremost because they represent half the population in any given country. So if you're thinking about active nonviolent resistance without active inclusion and leadership of women, you're kind of missing the boat. And when women get involved, of course, their participation expands the repertoire of tactics that any nonviolent campaign or movement can use. Rose got some pictures down the road, but even we talked about Armenia. Some of you may have been following the 11-day mass movement that led to the nonviolent ouster of the prime minister last week. Well, women were out in the streets taking a tactic from the Chilean nonviolent movement against Augusto Pinochet and banging pots and pans, you know, showing solidarity that we're together. So women kind of innovate tactically in many of the different campaigns and movements that we study. And also in many cases, they use their identities as mothers, as wives, so they use gendered roles in part to afford a movement, a campaign or movement, authority and legitimacy. They become fierce, especially when they've lived through profound violence, that we need to do something to end the violence, end the war. You all are probably familiar with the Liberian women's movement that helped end the civil war in that country after years of violence. So women can act out their role as women, as mothers, as wives. Another very famous case is in Argentina when the women went out to the Plaza de Mayo. And this was at a time during the late 70s, early 80s, when there was significant repression targeting anyone who was challenging the military junta. So what these women did, and their husbands and sons had been disappeared, and so they just began to march silently. They wore white scarves on their heads with their sons' names stitched in, and they just marched peacefully in the plaza that was in front of the presidential palace. So in a way, in that case and in others, women create political space where it otherwise would not exist. And they sometimes do that as mothers, as wives, so gendered roles can be particularly important. Women also have unique points of leverage. So some of the more interesting, effective tactics that women have used involve things like sex boycotts and nudity, things that kind of only women can do in these cases. So Liberia being a classic example, West Africa, East Africa, nudity is like a thing, and it brings about significant shame if it's threatened and things like that. So women, both through their numbers, through their ability to introduce new tactics, and then probably in many cases, the most important thing is their organizing prowess. Women know how to organize. So they do a lot of things that are kind of behind the scenes in movements. Everything you think about the Ukrainian Maidan movement or the Egyptian revolution, the Tahrir Square mobilization. The women are organizing food kitchens, medical tents, working the logistics. So a lot of the behind the scenes work that goes into building and sustaining a movement over time is often done by women in these cases. So those are just a few things that get at kind of why women matter in these movements.
Great. Thank you. And Maria, you mentioned that women create political space, right? So turning over to Marie, we're increasingly learning about how women have found unique openings to advance equality and inclusion during and after conflict. And your new book, War, Women, and Power, highlights how following the wars in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, women mobilized in significant ways that opened up avenues for their own political participation, but you argued that it was short-lived. Can you give us a little bit of insight into the trends that you discovered, and what recommendations would you have for policymakers who are trying to advance sustainable inclusion during transformative moments in time?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ro, and to my other panelists. It's really a delight to be here with all of you today. Ro, you mentioned kind of the book that I just finished, that just came out, which does explore this puzzle around the idea that we know war is profoundly destructive, but it can also be a period of rapid social change in which oftentimes women find themselves in spaces and actually taking on roles that they weren't able to take on prior to the conflict. I began doing research on the project more than a decade ago when I came across a woman named Ignatienne in Rwanda, who had been a housewife and a young mother in Rwanda in 1994 when the genocide broke out. And she described to me, after losing her parents and also after losing her husband, how it wasn't really a choice to move forward. You either do it or you don't. You either do it or you die. To be able to actually continue having any sort of semblance of life and normalcy and prospects of hope in the future for her and for her child, she needed to take on all the roles and responsibilities that had previously been done by other members of her family during the war. And Ignatienne found herself surrounded by this community of other women that had lost husbands, that had lost family members, and their grief in many ways helped to bring them together. Through this process of grieving, and also through a process of working together to achieve the basic necessities of life, food, water, shelter, medical care, education for their kids. They began to form small community organizations that became a foundation for collective action as the years passed. A few years later, Ignatienne, as she was working with this community organization that she had helped found in Rwanda, became connected to some international NGOs and became encouraged by other people in those organizations to consider taking her voice and her expertise to a political space. Through one election and then another, Ignatienne now sits in Rwanda's parliament, which boasts the highest level of women in parliament of any country in the world. And so this process of understanding war as not merely a period of destruction, although it is certainly that, but also as this period of rapid social transformation, I think allows us to look at the agency, the resilience, and the power of women in these situations of unimaginable pain and loss. I started doing research in Bosnia shortly after that and found very similar stories about the way in which pain and grief had helped women organize in their communities. And I remember speaking to a woman named Kada who had lost dozens of members of her family during the Bosnian War. And she described to me how one of the things that brought Bosnian women together to engage in collective action was the fact that they didn't know what had happened to many of their loved ones. There was a lack of information. Where she actually didn't know when the war came to an end whether her husband and her son were still alive, and she described to me how protests were the only way to be heard. Protests were the way to demand that the government actually take the initiative to search for those that had gone missing during the conflict. She talked about how protests also became a way of grieving together in a group and expressing their anger about the injustice of what had happened during the war. And to this day, Kada and so many other women in Bosnia continue to protest against the lack of answers about the war, the lack of justice, the lack of durable, equitable peace in Bosnia. And so these stories join with hundreds and thousands of other stories of the way in which war can be a period in which women take on these sort of public-facing roles and can engage in movements that aim to build a transition from war to peace that is more sustainable, more durable, and more gender just. in my research, I found, you know, Ro asked about some sort of policy kind of implications or recommendations, and the one, and I can talk more about this sort of as the conversation evolves, but the one that really is at the front and center of the work that I've done is that we can't see women only as victims during periods of armed conflict, because while many suffer tremendously and are victimized indeed in myriad ways, the power that women exhibit during ongoing conflict is a source for building more peaceful and democratic societies moving forward in the post-war period, and it needs to be harnessed, and it needs to be recognized and brought kind of more centrally into our conversations about peace building and about building more durable peace after armed conflict.
Great, thank you. That's very hopeful. We're going to take a quick moment to just show a short video. It's just a trailer of the role women played in the Maidan, which was the uprising in Ukraine in 2013. So just to give you a little bit of glimpse of what this looks like on the ground before we hear from Lola, who could actually give us some real life experience. Here we go.
Як це бути дівчинку з косичкою? Ну, я не знаю просто, як це можна. Я не уявляла такого взагалі.
Мами за дітей! Мами за дітей!
Ми вас захистимо. І для цього ми вийшли, щоб вас лишити.
Чай майданівський, підходьте, гарячий.
Я дуже хочу, щоб в мене лишалася надія.
Нам часто хлопці казали, що так хочеться втекти, а дивимось на вас і розуміємо, що якщо ви стоїте, ми таки не можемо.
Okay. Hold on, sorry. Let me just make sure it doesn't play again. How do I get out? So this is a fantastic film. This is a fantastic film if you do want to see the full version of it, Women of the Maidan. Really incredibly powerful. So Lola, let's go to you. Thank you. First, let me thank you for your work in advocating for greater accountability in government processes and for your work in highlighting particularly the plight of young women in northern Nigeria in the Bring Back Our Girls movement. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this work first, and then what effective strategies have you seen in raising awareness of your efforts and helping to change government behavior? I think that's the ultimate objective as well.
Sure. Thank you so much for the pleasure of being here. So I actually was born and raised in Nigeria, and then I migrated to the U.S. When I was 16 and went to school here. My first career is an architect. So I actually went to architecture school and worked as an architect for about 10 years before switching careers, because I realized that I feel this responsibility of service, and you know, architecture wasn't necessarily what I was looking for at the time. You know, even though as an architect you still can be an activist, and I come from a family of you know, people who've been in politics, who've been in civil service, but also who also have been activists. My uncle in the 1993 elections with the now late MKO Abiola, when Babangida was president of Nigeria, was imprisoned because, you know, they nullified the election results. And so, you know, coming from there, it kind of has always been in me to be this person who, when I see injustice, can't just shut my mouth up. I have to do something about it. And it's always this Margaret Mead quote of never underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world. And that sticks so close to me in no matter where I am, whatever I do. And so from that, getting into the social sector, becoming a community organizer around HIV/AIDS and homelessness issues in the DC area, because at the time DC's epidemic levels were over 3%, which is a worldwide epidemic by any standards. I realized that I also wanted to do and stay engaged with what was happening on the continent. And so I would start, paying attention to what was going on, tracking who is a leader, who is involved in organizing, and just either supporting in my own way, reaching out. If it was like, okay, can I donate something to the cause? I would do it, even if it was just $100. $100 could go a long way to buying T-shirts, to branding, and all this stuff. And then in 2014, I actually was in Thailand with my mother, and I see this ticker flash on CNN's screen. It says 270-something girls in Nigeria kidnapped. And I was like, whoa, 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 wait, was that Nigeria? Was that somewhere else? But did they say 200? And so we sat down and we waited for it to scroll back, and we just looked at each other like, what is going on? And so we start making phone calls to family and friends in Nigeria, like, did you guys hear about this? And they say, yes, but it's not real. It's politics. They were kidnapped by the opposition. It's because Jonathan is running for re-election. This is all, APC, which is the opposition party. This is all they're doing. They're just holding them. They've probably paid the families. And that's kind of what I heard. And, being on Twitter, social media has been an amazing tool when it comes to our work and the ability to get information out. A lot of people don't have electricity, but Africa has, I think, the most people with mobile devices. And so that is how we get information, that's how we communicate, that's how we learn. And so everyone pretty much has a mobile device. At this point, it's almost a smart device, and not just SMS texting, which we saw a few years ago. So, I'm on Twitter, and then I'm noticing that this tweet about #BringBackOurGirls, I said, okay, so it's not false. And so I reached out to, at the time, Dr. Obi Ezekisili, and I asked her, is there anything we can do in DC? And she said, well, just keep tweeting for now. Just keep tweeting. We need the volume to get louder on what happened. And so fast forward a few days later, I get back to DC. I'm making phone calls to the embassy. As a citizen of Nigeria, that's the official representation of Nigeria in the United States. I should be able to ask questions of my government. What are you doing? And then I'm getting information from Nigeria about the parents, and they verified that their daughters are missing. So it's like all this stuff is happening. And by the way, I'm like, this is not my job. I'm just a concerned citizen who wants information. And so after multiple phone calls and meetings and getting the door literally slammed in my face, I got angry again and posted on Facebook. And I said, well, using the Margaret Mead quote, if anyone's interested in going to say hello to the Nigerian embassy, join me 5 days from now. And in fact, May 6th will be the exact 4 years of when we did that protest. And so 5 days later, putting my architecture hat on, putting my organizing hat on, I recognize there are a few things that when it comes to mobilizing and organizing, it doesn't happen randomly, contrary to what people think. There's a lot of planning that goes into a protest. And one of the things I did not want to happen was when you saw images from the protest, it would be that one person who may look a little crazy that the press has been able to capture in motion. And so I wanted consistency, and so I asked for volunteers and designed, signs, T-shirts, banners, everything within 5 days, got a permit, did everything. And I showed up on the May 6th, and lo and behold, so did 300 plus people. And I was, not only 300 plus people, like press from all over the world showed up as well. And everyone is asking who's in charge here, and they were pointing at me. And so I said, okay, all right, I guess you're up. So what are you gonna do about this? And I remember Athena Cage from CNN sticking a mic in my face and asking me, what's the name of your group? And I said, crap, it's like, these are the things I hadn't thought about. You know, I just thought we were gonna do one protest and that's it. And that we would have answers and we would spark, you know, we would shame the government into action, because like you said, shame is a very powerful thing. As Africans, shame is a very powerful thing. I will say it again, shame is a very powerful thing. We don't want people in our closets, but when our closets get exposed and the mess starts pouring out, then all of a sudden government seems to have a response. And that kind of was what happened. And so when she asked me, what's the name of your group? I said, well, we're acting for accountability. And then I was like, ding. Act for accountability. And literally on the spot, that was how the name came about. But it became a thing where, you know, that same evening, President Obama officially came out and said he had now officially spoken with President Jonathan. And I said, I know that didn't happen without our actions. When it was on the news, it was on the front page of Washington Post, and it was, you know, this split image of a crowd of 300 plus people in the same T-shirts, in the same banners, and then on the other side you had embassy officials, 3 of them looking like literally caged animals. Like they had, the fence was blocked and it's just 3 of them there, and then you pan to the other side and you see the sea of people. And that was the image that was circulating, and culminating that with organizing with people in New York, people in London, in Paris, in Nigeria. We all were on phone calls saying, okay, we need to keep the pressure on. And you know, I think it also worked that this was a period when the current government was seeking re-election. And so they wanted to be seen as doing something. And you know, you have to look at all the environmental and factors of what could be the right strategy. You know, if it was a non-election season, would it have had as much action? Maybe not. However, we all know, going back to what I said about shame and exposing the truth, if it wasn't that the international media picked it up, I tell you, nothing would have been done. And we still are here 4 years later. We still have 100 plus girls missing, plus thousands of other Nigerians that were also kidnapped by Boko Haram. And we're still fighting and asking and demanding that the government do more. But it's also been very challenging, and I think we'll talk about some of the challenges later. But I think that when it comes to the role of women, it has been said, it was people who were identified as mothers, who identified as daughters. I went to school in Nigeria. That could have been me. You know, that could have been my cousin. That could have been anyone. So that visceral reaction of, besides the fact they're Nigerians, besides the fact that they're girls and young women, they're human beings. And no human being anywhere in the world should have to fear that because I want an education, that means my life is in danger. If their parents are okaying their wish and their desire to have their daughters educated, then who or what is Boko Haram to take that right away from them? And that's what we've continued to stand for, is that, you know, as women, we understand the value of women in society. We understand that women are the heart and the beating heart of any community. If women are not able to be engaged in the economic, the day-to-day functionings of any family, then you see families fall apart. So if you think of our nation as a family, what happens when women can't get educated? We're already you know, set back when it comes to access to jobs, access to decent pay, access to all these, you know, access to being a political candidate. You know, Rwanda is a great example of, you know, making sure that in the quota, in the law, there's a quota of number of women that have to be candidates. Unfortunately, Nigeria is not yet there. But we are seeing that as a result of Bring Back Our Girls, we now have a violence against persons law. that was passed, that it is a criminal offense for anyone to attack a woman or a child under the age of 16. It's an offense that you automatically are liable to go to prison for a long number of years. We're seeing that people who were part of the Bring Back Our Girls movement we're demanding the right to run to be electoral candidates. And so now we have a bill that was passed, not too young to run. So you're seeing that as a result of this campaign that started and really stayed singularly focused on the message, because a lot of people asked us, well, why aren't you talking about this? Why aren't you talking about that? We were like, these girls represent all these issues that you're talking about. But if we don't stay focused on this one issue, then we run the risk of diluting the message and spreading ourselves too thin, because this is a movement that is non-funded. The decision not to accept external funding was a catch-22. It was my money, individuals' monies that went into and continue to sustain the movement. And people think, oh, you guys are either have political aspirations. I could care less about politics. I just want you to do your job. That's all I care about. Or that we are working for the opposition. Again, we have another president, but it's still the same political rhetoric. You guys are the opposition, the girls didn't get kidnapped, blah, 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 4 years later. And, on top of that, we see that those in Abuja who, since day one, have been sitting at the Unity Fountain, day in, day out, 4 p.m., you go to Unity Fountain in Abuja, they are there. And now this present administration has taken to force of having police out there, using tear gas to have them disperse, to barricading streets. But the women who are there are still fired up. And again, thanks to this, now it's you can't hide. Mm-hmm. So the moment these incidents are happening, it's on Twitter, and we're all like, oh, really? Is this what you're going to do? And then we start hashtag tweeting at the president, hashtag tweeting at BBC, CNN. It's like, do you all see what is happening? And if you all will ignore this, then you all are failing when it comes to your responsibility of making sure you're shining the light on what is going on in the world.
Thank you, Lola, so much. I mean, our heart hurts for these girls, but to know that you're out there is so inspiring, taking action and holding people accountable by shining a light. Maria, I saw you vigorously writing because you were pointing out all the tactics that Lola and the team are using that are successful in their ultimate goals. Before we move on to how best to support these types of movements, do you want to highlight any of those, or should we move to the support?
No, I mean, just very briefly, and thanks again, Lola, for sharing your story. That's why peace building needs activism, by the way. It's really wonderful. I mean, a couple things that stood out for me was just, the whole point about there's the myth of the spontaneous protest. There is so much effort, organizing, preparation, often training that goes into protests and movement building that often goes under the radar, and women are often in the forefront of this. As Americans, we have this iconic image of Rosa Parks sitting down in the bus and refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Many people don't realize that, she had been part of a 3-year organizing effort led by the Women's Black Caucus of Alabama to prepare a boycott. And so that action, which was fully planned, sparked a nationwide series of boycotts. And Ella Baker was the one that brought all these people together to help organize a critical element of the U.S. civil rights movement. So the level of preparation, planning, the shame part is a fascinating one. I don't want to overemphasize nudity and sex, but it can be important. Sometimes it can be powerful, and incidentally, the whole idea of like leverage through sex boycotts goes all the way back to Aristophanes, the portrayal of Lysistrata, how the women from Sparta and Athens came together, withheld sex from their lovers until they agreed to end the Peloponnesian War. So this kind of goes back quite a ways in history. So kind of using these leverage points, and the shame one, the organizing aspect of it, and then just the level of savviness when it comes to using the media, having effective spokespeople, being on message, on point. I mean, I think these are just like really, really important facets, obviously of your movement, but of movements around the world. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of the photos on the screen. And so you'll see the Bring Back Your Girls on the lower right, sorry. The protests in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, that Maria mentioned. Liberia on the left, Maria mentioned that one as well. Venezuela, that was the Women's March last year against the oppression of the government. And you see some of the tactics of the tape and the hands up. And then the Syrian women's political movement on the lower left, they just organized in December of this past year. So you could see this is happening all around the world as we speak, and there's several more. We have the Me Too movement here in the United States that's actually global as well. So let's move to the types of support. So now that we understand what these women are doing, and actually, I'm not trying to plug this, but this is USIP's report, Women in Nonviolent Movements, only because this actually is a weekend read. This is something you would pick up on your own leisurely time to read it, just because it speaks of so many of these fascinating tidbits that we don't know about that Maria just mentioned. Okay, so let's turn to how best to support these women on the ground, because we know sometimes actually if there's too much overt support, it could actually backlash, right? And so we'll hear about some of the best ways to support these women. So Marie, let me turn to you, because you've been working directly on training these women activists from around the world in a program called Inclusive Global Leadership Institute at Denver University. So tell us a little bit more about the effective methods that you use to help support these women, and maybe a little bit more about the importance of solidarity, peer exchanges, networks. How does that play into the support that we provide?
Absolutely. So together, actually, with my colleague Erica Chenoweth, who was the person who co-wrote the book with Maria, Why Civil Resistance Works. It's a very small network of us that are doing this work.
Network.
Yes, thank you. No, but a dynamic network. And one of the things we've been committed to is trying to use research to inform the way in which we go about offering suggestions to activists so that they can most effectively wage these nonviolent movements for social change. And so Maria and Erica's work here is just so important. I cannot tell you how often I've heard from activists that the findings from their research is what allows them to go to their senior members of the movements that they're working within and say, hey, it's really important to maintain nonviolent discipline. It's so important to bring a cross-section of the population to the streets, because with that cross-section of the population, whether it's a gender-diverse cross-section, a racially and ethnically or religiously diverse cross-section, and a cross-section of people by age, this is what allows for a large number of people to come to the streets. And one of these findings that is so, I think, important and has become iconic is the way in which in mass movements to maximalist campaigns, to ones that aim to overthrow a regime, if you can get 3.5% of the population to the streets, you are successful. And that number, that 3.5% of the population number is a really powerful organizing tool that has directly informed activists in the field. Now, so what Erica and I have been working on for the last couple of years is an effort to honor and to kind of amplify and to elevate the work that women identified activists are doing at the grassroots all across the world to promote social change. And it stems from what Lola and Maria have both emphasized, which is that protests are rarely spontaneous. Movements are rarely spontaneous. They take so much strategy, so much planning, and this is where our role as researchers can come in, because the more we are able to say, these are the tactics, the strategies, even the percentage of women that must be present in a movement for it to have an increased likelihood of success, the more that those kind of research findings can directly inform the work that women are doing. So we have a large research project which is actually using the photo images that people that participate in protest movements take, upload to Twitter, which is a really powerful tool, as Lola mentioned. And we've designed a program basically to code the gender ratio of the crowds over time using these photo images. And what my work is now doing is to look at how the fluctuations in the gender ratio of the crowd how those fluctuations are associated with the likelihood that the movement is succeeding, or the likelihood that the movement is receiving violence from security forces. And we hypothesize, really, in social science speak, that the more women that are in the crowd, the less likely the movement is to, one, receive violence from security forces, and two, the less likely it is to actually have what political scientists call violent flanks emerge within the movement, which is the tendency of many movements that especially ones that are not deliberate from the get-go about strategic nonviolent discipline. These violent flanks can be members of the movement or loosely affiliated members of the movement that think that picking up arms will help the movement succeed. And the research really shows that this is not the case, that maintaining discipline and removing the likelihood of these violent flanks from emerging is actually key to movement success. So using that research, we run a summer institute now at the University of Denver. And the Summer Institute brings together frontline women activists from all over the world to do a training on civil resistance. So this training on what are the strategies and tactics that can be successfully used, to really demand government accountability, to advocate for environmental justice, to preserve water, to demand peace, to all sorts of different topics and causes. Last year, we launched this institute and had the most dynamic group I could possibly imagine. We had women that were running campaigns in Indonesia for government accountability, an environmental justice activist from Nigeria looking at women's the ways women needed to mobilize to counter climate change and to secure natural resources for their communities, to a woman from an undocumented activist from Phoenix, Arizona, that has been mobilizing around DACA and for kind of against ICE deportations of undocumented people in the United States, to a very incredible and really legendary feminist activist from India who has been advocating for women and LGBT rights in India for many years. So this assortment of women and their incredible expertise, what came out of this inaugural institute, and we have another one scheduled for August, is the importance of centering the expertise of the women activists themselves in these trainings, and of creating space for the sharing of knowledge and of experiences, because my Lord, I was floored so often by the fact that so many women said, from completely different parts of the world, completely different types of campaigns, that's happened to me too. I see what you're talking about here, and I know exactly kind of that's happened to me, right? And so this creating a space for the sharing of these experiences, not only in an emotional way, but also in an extremely tactical one. We had a woman activist from Uganda who talked about how she was able to enter parliament when she was very pregnant. And she used her pregnancy in this kind of strategic way to say, hey, you know, I'm gonna actually provoke and push buttons with my belly out, because I'm gonna kind of use this idea that I'm a mother and you wouldn't want to harm me right now, to engage in an incredibly political and subversive set of protests against President Museveni in Uganda, as he wanted to continue staying in power and changing the constitution to allow him to stay in power. And several other women said, gosh, you know, when I was pregnant, I remember doing a similar thing, and actually kind of it created a vulnerability on one side, but also this ability for me to navigate spaces, even sometimes more safely than I would have when I was not pregnant, because I didn't fear so much the violence from security forces. So I think this creating a space for women to share their experiences, their expertise, tactically and otherwise, to build solidarity across movements and to understand the shared causes, the shared goals that so many women across the world have in mind for their own lives, but for their children's lives, for their nations, for their communities. We've just seen the fruits of this effort really pay off as women have gone back to their communities and taken on really important leadership roles in these movements. And I spent Monday of this week reading through the 196 women's applications that were nominated for this year's Summer Institute. 196, and we have 15. So it was heartbreaking, but let me just tell you, like, you know, the argument that there aren't women leading in these movements, even if they're not visible on TV or in front of a camera, I mean, it's just, you know, dead to me forever, because there were movements that I had no idea this type of work was being done, and reading through these applications, I mean, for me, was just such a humbling experience, because the bravery and the types of work, that the creative strategies that women are applying all around the world to make their you know, to build more peaceful and gender just societies is truly remarkable.
Thank you for your work there. Yes, please. So Maria, over to you. Do you want to tell us more about your past research, or you're doing current research right now as well, to look at how best external actors support these grassroots movements on the ground? Do you want to share some initial findings from that research, or from your own experience at the Institute when you were there last year?
Yeah, no, sure, and that's incredible experience, and what they've been able to pull together with IGLE, with the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative over just a couple of years, has been remarkable. So I think, you know, to the question of external actors, we all know that when it comes to these movements, the most important actors are the local actors themselves and the women who are on the front lines of change. But, you know, sometimes outside actors, whether they're solidarity groups, whether they're diplomats, whether they're NGOs, international organizations, can play important roles in both promoting an enabling environment for nonviolent mobilization to take place, to push back when governments use violent repression against unarmed peaceful activists. And in many cases, governments who organize and coordinate diplomatic pressure against repressive regimes is one of the most important things that outside actors can do to support activists and movements. One thing we found in the research for Why Civil Resistance Works is that one of the most important variables involving outside actors that correlated with the success of nonviolent campaigns was when a patron state who was backing a repressive regime removed their support. So think the US government removing support from the Marcos regime in the Philippines during the People Power movement there, removing support from the Shah in Iran prior to the '79 revolution. So, systematically taking away, the economic, military, and other resources of repressive governments is a really, really important thing that outside actors can do. But I think when it comes to non-governmental actors, and probably most of you are coming from the non-governmental space, I think what Marie was saying about providing space and forums for activists and movement leaders to come together and swap notes, share experiences, learn from each other, teach in a way about how to wage nonviolent struggles effectively is one of the most important things that outside actors can do to support women's leadership in these campaigns and movements, and supporting women as leaders. So really emphasizing, the important roles that they play in decision-making in these movements. So of course the behind-the-scenes organizing is critically important, and that's what sustains movements in many of these cases. But women having active leadership roles and supporting them with the skills, knowledge, know-how about how to kind of exert leadership in these campaigns and movements, I think is really, really important. And then on the funding sense, it's a fascinating case with Bring Back Our Girls. Money is not the end-all, be-all. As Ro mentioned, money can sometimes divide an otherwise legitimate authoritative movement, can split it off into factions. One of the last things you want to do as an outside actor is to create a marketplace for activism. That's generally a bad idea. But sometimes small amounts of thoughtful financial assistance from outside actors that follows the agenda of local movement leaders and activists can be very, very important. It can help them buy t-shirts. It can help them get sound systems for outside festivals. It can help them with their media engagement, to reach out to different groups across the country that otherwise they wouldn't have the money to pay for bus fare. So, sometimes there actually is an important role for strategically targeted funding to be able to support these campaigns and movements. So those are just a few things.
Yeah, please, Lola, we were going to go right to you because you did mention not taking donor funding. So tell us a little bit more about the decision you made to do that, and also any other areas of support that are most helpful.
Sure. So the decision to not accept external funding when it came to the active organizing activism for Bring Back Our Girls was because it was, like I said, it was an extremely high political period where people were looking for someone to blame, and they didn't want to look at themselves in the mirror. So it could be like, oh, it's those people from the Bring Back Our Girls movements. They're the troublemakers because they're being funded by USAID, or they're being funded by the APC, or they're supported by this politician and that. And so we had tons of conversation, between DC, New York, London, Abuja, Lagos, as to what do we do to be able to keep the movement going. And then we all kind of agreed that, not accepting external monies for the active organizing aspect of the work is the right thing to do. And so we all work, I consult on the side, so it was everyone pitching in their individual coins, like we like to say, putting your coins into it, and doing that. And you also saw people who are like individuals like yourselves who would say, you know what, I know this is not easy, what can I pay for? So for us, it was after the first two protests, it was like, all right, my bank account is like taking a hit when it comes to this stuff. But people, like you said, rental of equipment to make sure that we could still do that. Can you pay for a permit if we need to get a permit? Or can you pay for a bus? Because there are young people who wanted to come from, Baltimore, high schools in Baltimore to show solidarity, but we didn't have the money to pay for a bus. Do you mind renting the bus? So we had individuals who were like, sure, $300, $500, I'll take care of that. And because at that time, we also were not an organization. So I can't even technically accept any donations from you because that's illegal. In the United States, the IRS would be knocking on my door. And so recognizing again that, all right, if there is all this support out there, maybe what we need to do is figure out on the US side, how do we build credibility into this? Because in Nigeria, it's a different ball game. Having individuals who are doing this work without any affiliation is one thing, but here we have to leverage the fact that we are in the United States, and not just in the United States, we're in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of opportunity here to be on this side saying to the U.S., hey, by the way, this is happening in Nigeria. Have you thought about these issues? How are you holding Nigeria accountable? But coming from an entity gives it more legitimacy and credibility than just Lola saying, hey, I'm just going to the State Department to have a meeting. And so that way we decided to formalize and to go the route of a nonprofit. We still haven't received any external funding. It's really just individuals who volunteer their time at this point. But that said, we recognize that we also needed, because I've also trained professionally as a community organizer. I've gone through the trainings of understanding what you need to do in a nonviolent, peace-building setting, just because I realized that I was doing it intuitively. I just needed a little bit more of that technical understanding of how do you host an accountability meeting, and how do you host it when the person that you're trying to hold accountable is antagonistic. How do you make sure you don't derail a meeting like that and it's still effective, and the reporting afterwards. And so we realized that what all these skills and that many of us and the volunteers of Act for Accountability have been working on, we need to share this information with people, especially women, who were really interested in, Lola, how did you get started? Like, I'm interested in this. I want to do this. I want to go back to my country. I want to do this. And so we registered in Nigeria as an NGO. And the plan is starting next year, we're in the early stages of developing like an organizing boot camp for women, targeting women and young ladies who are in college, because we're seeing that issues of institutions and professors and colleges asking and demanding sex for grades is an issue that has come up. It's always been there, but now we've had one case where one professor has publicly is going through the judicial system and is being charged because there's evidence that he was demanding sex in exchange for this young woman's grades. And so we have young women who are saying, how can I be more effective with my voice? And they don't have necessarily a place or a way to do it. They're not interested in being politicians. They're just interested in being stronger in their agency, and that they have no fear when it comes to speaking truth to justice, when it's near or far. And so we are in this early stages of figuring out what this boot camp could look like based on what people are already doing. So it's taking knowledge on organizing, mobilizing, and peace building, but what has been effective locally? And I think that's key. And so, yeah, we'll figure out, we're hoping we can find the funding for that. However, I think that it is the step in taking a lot of things that people have been doing and building a structure that can be sustained. And so many people from the Bring Back Our Girls movement I've recruited to be either guests or to be lecturers. They can take a piece of the curriculum and teach that. It's when you are faced with military or police officers who have guns and are threatening to tear gas you, but you know that the Constitution says you have the right to assemble. What do you do in that moment? Again, that gender role of, I am a woman, you inherently know they're not going to shoot me. Because if they do, then it is not just the police officer who is going to be in trouble. It will be outright chaos nationally. That the police under this president killed a mother, that the police under this president killed a daughter, that the police under this president killed a peaceful organizer who is demanding the safe return of other girls and women. that would be catastrophic. And that would be the end of this administration. So a lot of the women in the Bring Back Our Girls movement know there's a limit to what they will do. They may throw the tear gas, but they're not going to throw it in my face. They may barricade us by holding hands, but guess what? They're not going to touch me, even if I'm in their face. And even if they drag us to the police stations, guess what? They're not going to abuse me. They're not going to touch me, because the moment I come out, guess where I'm going? And guess who's going to show up on my doorstep? BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and I will talk. And you can't do anything at that point. Once the information is out, that's it. So inherently, we know there's a limit to what they will do. And we've seen that anybody who crosses that unspoken boundary has had hell to pay for it. And that the whole force of whatever, because nobody wants to be affiliated with that, they will throw that person under the bus. And so that is like a critical aspect of it that we're trying to incorporate into this boot camp is, as a woman, you have to understand that power is, there's a limit at to which they will go. But what they're trying to do is to break you down and to allow that fear to grow stronger and bigger. But what you have to remember is, I am a woman, and I am female, and there's a lot of power that comes with that. And so, you know, building and designing that, I think that's the kind of support that we see needs to happen, is how do we train young women and women in general who are interested in being organizers or who are interested in seeing change in their local community be more effective, but also be stronger, recognizing that there are things they can, and their tactics and strategies they can use without placing themselves necessarily in danger.
Thank you. I am so fascinated by this concept of using your gender role to the benefit of the movement. Basically, whether it's a role as a woman or a mom. You mentioned it. It was mentioned in the Maidan video. Can you touch a girl? How can you touch a girl with braids? I mean, it seems a little counterintuitive, right? We don't want to reinforce these gender stereotypes, but at the same time, if you can use it, you know, go with the grain. Well, I could ask many more questions. Particularly, I know we were going to go to questions on the challenges women face, the cultural norms that we just spoke about, their role as a mother and as an activist. How do they balance that? But let me first see what questions you have. Oh, okay, we got hands going up. So I will definitely go to you guys, and if you want to talk about the challenges, you could weave it in, or how else we support them. Let's take, is it okay to take 3 at a time? You guys can manage? Okay. Yep, we've got some runners. Yeah, yep, 3 at a time we'll take. We've got a full half hour, so we'll try and keep the responses a little bit shorter so we can get in more questions.
Are you saying I can ask 3 questions?
Oh, yeah. I knew there would be a lot from this group. Let's keep it to 1 so we can get the diversity of perspectives.
I'm not very good at names, so I apologize. I think this is a question for Marie in the black dress. You mentioned a statistic, something like the following, if I wrote it down correctly, that if you can mobilize 3.5% of the population to the street, you are successful. What did you mean by successful?
So this is great. I said that, but it's Maria's research that came up with that statistic. So I'm punting.
And this is something, actually, Erica Chenoweth, my co-author, is the numbers person of the pair, so she likes to collect data and run regressions and the like. So as part of the effort to collect data on why civil resistance works, she kind of did a slightly separate project just to study, like, what, you know, when people are mobilizing against a regime of a dictatorship and authoritarian regimes, at what point does it become impossible for them to stay in power? And basically she found that if you're able to mobilize 3.5% of the population to engage in active protest, no regime historically has managed to stay in power. So, and also I'll flag that Erica did a TED Talk on the
Yes.
3.5% rule. So Google Erica and 3.5.
And you know,
It's being used
yeah.
now in several venues across
Venezuela,
the US.
for instance.
Yeah, and the world, this 3.5 number, so.
So the Women's March this year, the Women's March, oftentimes people were asking, you know, this was the biggest single day sort of protest. The Women's March right after inauguration. I think, what was it? It brought about 1.7% of the population to the streets. So we still got a ways to go.
So you can analogize from overthrowing regimes to more localized peace movements?
So this is where it's,
Yeah.
I mean, this is where we have to be a little bit careful when it comes to numbers, and Eric and I have discussed this as well. So it's a seems to be a firm statistical notion that regimes can't stay in power. There's overlap in the sense that we know that the single most important variable in determining the success of movements, campaigns, is participation. So it absolutely makes sense. But my word of caution to that is it takes more than just numbers. And it takes more than just people taking to the streets. Sometimes there's kind of a fetishization of street protests, I must say, and it's one tactic out of hundreds, if not thousands, of nonviolent tactics. And so it's less about, like, you know, can we get a gazillion people out into the streets, and more like, okay, how should we think about sequencing tactics so that we're actually going to advance our goals and to maximize the leverage? How do we think about using protest in the context of a campaign that uses boycotts, strikes, stay-at-home, sit-ins, go-slows, vigils, funerals, marches? I mean, there are, like, you know, lots of things that people can do. So the only thing I get a little nervous about with the 3.5% rule is that people just obsess over mass mobilization. And, like, it does take mobilization, but it also takes savvy organizing and organization, and that's a different skill set, but very much related. But yes, 3.5% rule.
Okay, I know we have an excited group.
Can I just add
Oh,
quickly
wait,
to
sorry,
that?
go ahead.
Also, it's about consistency, like staying the course, because you see movements, you know, they'll peak, you know, you have that, you know, big showing, and then slowly, you know, it dips. But it's about, regardless of whether it dips or not, it's that there's still a core section of people that are advancing those different tactics, that are advancing the strategies, and are figuring out different ways to make sure it stays relevant. Because, again, like we know, there's so much going on in the world. Our attention spans are like gnats. You know, it's like, pew, 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 you know, something's going on. But you need people who are going to be consistently staying the course. And I think that's why we're still talking about BBOG, Bring Back Our Girls, 4 years later. Is there still people who have stayed when the fanfare, the cameras, and all that stuff have gone, and are still advancing it?
Great. So let's get three. So don't respond yet till we hear three. I know this is an active group. Yeah, you go for it. Yep, you've got the microphone. And who is it
I
next?
have a
Yep.
question for
Let's get to the
Marie.
back too.
The institute at the University of Denver, you said you have 15 slots and you had 196 applicants. What's it going to take to scale that up to accept
Wait,
the
let's keep
150?
going.
Yep,
Scale
that's
up.
good.
Yep, go for it.
You mentioned the need for funding for T-shirts and buses and things. I was wondering, is there a foundation or entity that exists already that takes donations from people and can vet and distribute that money to small individuals and entities for T-shirts and buses and things?
It's interesting.
Well,
It's clearinghouse.
yes, that's a clearinghouse. I think that's what part of. Oh, sorry.
One
more
Oh, yeah,
question,
sorry.
one
Go
more
ahead.
question in the back.
Okay, my question might be related to that, is in the context of the recent March for Your Lives protest, which wasn't, you know, only women. So I have a variety of questions on that, and a variety of things you talked about is funding. What was the behind the scenes funding? I assume there was funding for that national organization. And how were women specifically strategized as a face of that, for empathetic purposes maybe? And are there any future other related tactics that are being pursued in the March for Your Lives topic?
Okay, yeah, why don't you go first on the scale up?
Sure. So thank you for that question. The short, quick answer is funding. How do we scale up and actually accept more than 15 activists? But I'll also say that I think that there's something important about not about keeping it intimate and small. I'll say that at the end of our civil resistance training, as part of our institute, we go to the mountains and we create space to develop solidarity outside of sort of intellectual conversations and connect from a more, I think, interpersonal level, which I find to be actually the most important part of the institute. And so if we were to have 150 women, I don't think we would be able to connect in the same way. Yes. So that is actually the plan, and what we'd like to do is make it global. And so we have proposals written right now, and we're in the funding seeking phase to have annual IGLI institutes in 4 different parts of the world as kind of our 5-year plan. Yeah. So hopefully it'll happen.
So to your question around funding for small items, and so that's actually what we're doing. So one of the goals why we registered in Nigeria was to also be able to create a fund where activists can apply to for their work. It's we're looking at small grants because we realize on average it could just be like 100,000 naira, which is less than $200. To be able to buy T-shirts and all these things that they need to get up and running. But we're trying to also make sure it's tied to this boot camp so that people are, it's a way of vetting. It's a way of building that database of activists around the country. It's a way of identifying women who are engaged in whether they're 16 years old in their local high school to a 65-year-old woman who wants to make sure that the pothole in her local community is filled. So that's kind of what we're doing, is that we're creating that fund. And if you're interested in giving, we will definitely be accepted. But it has, I think that in giving that kind of support, we want to make sure that there is some kind of education that is tied to it, which is part of the verification and making sure that the people who use the money, it's not just going to go to like a shopping spree or anything like that.
Just a quick point on that, because there are people are interested in different movements, different causes and the like. The one thing I've noticed is often on the outside you want to give to a good cause, and it seems like almost instinctually we think about only the big organizations, the big NGOs, and it's not as if they shouldn't receive funding and they're not doing important work, but there is a minuscule percentage of outside assistance that actually gets to the grassroots in any of these places. And so it's worth the effort to query like who's actually doing the organizing, mobilizing, and how can I contribute to these types of grassroots organizations, because they really don't get the level of attention that the other NGOs do. So just as a general.
Not that I know of.
Because I think one of the things is that when it comes to, I can only speak for Nigeria because that's where a lot of my work has been. The concept of organizing is still sort of new when you think of it as a formal thing. But it's inherent to what we've always done. Mm-hmm. And so now you're telling people, oh, you need to organize. They're like, what do you mean organize? Like, we're just going down to make sure we see the local officer at the office. So there's a lot of education around that. So even building structure and systems and entities around a culture that already is doing it, there's always this back and forth. Do we need to be formalized? Don't we need to be formalized? And while certain movements have chosen not to formalize, there still has to be an entity that is, an organization that can be that clearinghouse, that can say, okay, there are all these entities working on this issue or that issue. And you have some of them in, like Clean Foundation focuses specifically on police and justice. So they kind of are the umbrella entity for clearinghouse of all these other smaller NGOs that do work on police and local justice issues. So you do have, you have the organization on women in politics. So that's another clearinghouse for women and organizations that focus on getting women elected. So you have them in different pockets based on sector. But one overarching organization on just, funding for these kinds of things, no, we don't have that.
No, just like, larger organizations, Grassroots International would probably be getting a little bit closer to, I think, what you're talking about. So Grassroots International focuses on grassroots kind of causes around the world, has small donors, organizations that specialize in trainings around the world, Beautiful Trouble, Beautiful Rising, Rise. So there are organizations that, are small, that individuals, they survive on individual kind of funding. And so, anyway, we can talk after as well.
March for Our Lives. Yes, let's go to March for Our Lives. I think you've written on this a little bit, or for the youth movement, so maybe you want to go and then you want to.
So about women's roles, one of the most powerful, we're a nonpartisan institute, so I won't opine on the politics behind March for Our Lives, but one of the most powerful moments was when, one of the leaders, Emma Gonzalez, had 5 minutes of silence on a stage. There's power in silence, actually. And so, I think that's kind of an image that's staying with a lot of people. I know that here in DC, the Women's March was very involved in helping to organize March for Our Lives, so they very quickly reached out to Women's March to help kind of bring together the logistics. So, that's the thing, we're in an era of intersectional movements, so understanding, violence and oppression in one realm and how it relates to similar things in another realm is really important. So kind of movement of movements activity is really important, and women are gonna play an important role in that. But this is one case where women have a prominent spokesperson role, and, I would say on a personal note that Emma's doing a very good job for her part so far.
Absolutely. And in addition to partnering with the Women's March, also especially driven from some of the youth activists, the Parkland survivors, reaching out to the movement for Black Lives and building those connections across these different sort of intersectional issue areas. The other thing I'll say is that the Movement for Our Lives also has more organizational, institutional ties, like with the Brady campaign and other nonprofits. So it goes back to what Maria was saying about the importance of not just having people in the streets, but also having a way in which kind of the movement speaks directly towards lobbying efforts, in Congress, other forms of sort of community organizing, other forms of political activism that don't necessarily only look like street protests. So I think that movement is really exciting. And I know in Denver, where I live, it brought a really interesting cross-section of the population to the streets. It was by far the most sort of politically and gender and age diverse march that I've seen in the last couple of years. So it was exciting in that sense.
Yep, next round. Let's take 3. Make sure we get to the back.
Hi, I'm interested in sustainability of change and have done a little work about that in a post-conflict moment. So you have a movement, and Marie spoke to the opportunity that can come at a moment of change, but that opportunity can be fleeting, right? And so I'm curious if the U.S. Institute of Peace or any of you have looked at ways, what's necessary to sustain, I'll say right now, women's agency so that one does not return to violence, so one does not return to corrupt government. And so I'm just curious what kind of work the Institute and others are doing on that. Thank you.
2 more.
Yeah, and I did want to press on the gender essentialist question that you raised right before you opened it up to us, and how, yes, in many cases, saying, I am a mother, I am a daughter, I'm an aunt, this is why this is important to me, that doesn't necessarily fit with, feminist pedagogy in some ways. So I did just want to bring that back out, since that's of interest, at least for the work that I do.
Thanks.
And one more question, student in the back? Somebody have the mic? No? It's okay, okay, go ahead.
Thank you all. My question relates to how this relates to what Dining for Women does. A lot of our funding goes to organizations that do girls' education, women's health, all those sort of good things. And I'm wondering, especially for the academic researchers, is there any correlation between the environment that the movement sees happen in and the success of the movement? So women's levels of education, women's levels of economic empowerment, et cetera. What effect does that have on the likelihood of a movement starting and the success of it?
Great, those are Those are some tough questions. Do you want to take the
Great
first one?
questions. Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, so actually, the part of Rose's question that she asked me at the beginning that I didn't answer, because in some ways it's a bit of a bummer, is the way in which so much of the progress that women, in the cases that I know the best, in Rwanda and Bosnia, how so much of that progress that women made during and after the period of armed conflict was undermined and set back. And in my research, I conducted interviews with about 260 women in these countries to see sort of how their lives had evolved before and after and since the violence. And there were three things that really stood out. In terms of what intervened to fracture and set back women's organizing. The first was the way in which the political settlement, or the way in which the wars were actually brought to an end, oftentimes excluded women from the peace processes, excluded women from kind of many of the conversations around good governance and so forth. But even more importantly, how the logic of violence tended to create, or the way in which the regimes created what I call hierarchies of victimhood, where particular categories of women were seen as those most deserving of aid or most deserving of a seat at the table. And so in Bosnia, for instance, this meant survivors of sexual violence and widows. And so what we see is a lot of the work that was being done across different experiences in the immediate aftermath of the war was actually fractured as certain groups became able to have a voice and certain groups were sort of silenced as a result. And so this has all these ramifications for undermining a lot of the mobilization that women were engaged in. The second was the way in which international humanitarian actors changed funding priorities on a whim. And so coming in the aftermath saying, we're going to prioritize democracy promotion. Oh, now actually we're going to prioritize women's economic empowerment. Oh, now we're going to prioritize refugee resettlement, and so forth. Led to the instability of many of these organizations that were formed around or forged in this position or in this context of needing to come together around shared grief and also shared sort of urgent needs. And so those organizations that were actually able to technocratically adjust to these changing demands were the ones that could flourish, and a lot of the ones that were truly organic grassroots movements ended up sort of dissipating. And then finally, and I think really importantly, and it speaks to some of the other questions and also some of the other themes, is this way in which violence is a part of many women's lives around the world. And in the aftermath of war, in particular, violence can continue to extend far beyond the theater of war and entrench itself in women's daily lives. What I call sort of a patriarchal backlash to the gains women make. And so this backlash is oftentimes thought of in terms of the continued legacies of trauma after war, or the increased availability of weapons, or the increased likelihood of, say, alcohol and drug use in the aftermath of war. But I argue it's also a result of oftentimes the way in which women get loud. To put it in the words of one of my interviewees during war, and the way in which men then begin to police women's increased kind of loudness or power, and by pushing them back into the domestic realm oftentimes through both verbal and physical violence. And this question of how do we sustain these gains then, I mean, I think there's so many lessons from those around putting funding decisions in local hands, at creating feedback mechanisms so that so we see that are rooted in the local community, so that technocratic understandings of sort of where funding should go don't actually supplant local knowledge and local women's experience of where funding would really make a difference. And I could talk about that at more length too, and I've written a lot about this. I want to quickly turn to this brilliant question, which is we talk and we celebrate the way in which sometimes women can strategically use their kind of these essentialized gendered roles around motherhood or around their more peaceful nature to achieve and advocate for kind of political goals. And I think that I oftentimes go back to Gayatri Spivak's work here, where she, a post-colonial feminist thinker who talks about, while that may be the case, these strategic essentialisms risk never fundamentally dismantling the structures that they seek to navigate within and to change. And so the question becomes about the limits of transformative change when movements rely on these kind of essentialized gendered roles. And so I think we can lean into the tension or the discomfort or the complication of this by understanding that while it allows, why these kind of the use of strategic gendered sort of roles allows for particular sets kind of for particular work to be done and for maybe women to even be more safe as they do that work, it can also limit the possibilities for transformation in the long run.
Great, thank you. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, I guess what what is USIP and other places doing in terms of post-conflict? I mean, I think there are different challenges in different countries in a post-conflict, post-settlement environment, but I think, what outside actors can do, and certainly USIP through some of the training work that we do in conflict resolution, conflict transformation. One thing that my team here at USIP has been developing is a new training guide that brings together nonviolent action and peace building intentionally. So it's called Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building, or SNAP. So it's really about, yes, that was intentional. And so it's really about kind of how in different environments people can use nonviolent mobilization to, gain participants, leverage, pressure, but at the same time know how to use things like dialogue, facilitation, negotiation to consolidate the wins of mobilization. So I think, there's a lot of, helpful activity in the realm of kind of how these different activities can be used most effectively.
I would just add one other piece of research that we're working on, and it's called overcoming resistance, elite resistance, mediator resistance. And basically what it's looking at is, so as we make these advances for more inclusion, what is that resistance that we're seeing, right? Because once we can understand what that resistance looks like, we can then figure out more strategies to overcome the resistance. So, right, you are going to see these advances and these setbacks, but the more we can calibrate and strategize around these setbacks, we'll be in a better position to mitigate how much pushback or how far a step back we are.
Oh, and we didn't answer the one about the empirics. Are there structural factors, environmental factors that influence the? So this was actually a question with the research. Are there certain factors that encourage the emergence and the outcomes of these violent or nonviolent campaigns? And we actually haven't found any. Erica maybe has since the last time I talked to her, but we didn't find that GDP mattered. We didn't find that homogeneity or heterogeneity of the society mattered in terms of outcomes of campaigns, the military might of the regime. So we kind of, we held constant in the analysis variables that you would think would influence the outcome, but you mentioned the literacy, and I somehow recall there's a study that's been done on the women's literacy rates and the outcomes of movements, and I can't remember if they found a statistically significant correlation or not. It's an Erica question, and I'll write to her after.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. Any last comments that anyone wants to make, Lola?
Well, I think that, a lot has been said today. The one thing I always leave people with is that regardless of what your interest is, please try to support local organizations, first of all. They are often the ones on the front line, the grassroots organizations that need not only financial but also technical support, because money is not everything. That being said, money is something. I would be happy to talk to anyone else or any other questions afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any remaining comments? Or?
Right after you wrap up, I want to make just one.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for a very lively discussion. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. As you can see, this is a very fun and inspiring space to work in. So we welcome you into this field because it really is for everyone. So thank you. One more time.
I just wanted to make one quick comment. I'm Susan Stahl. I serve as the Board of Directors Chair for Dining for Women. And we are frequently talking about the movement that we are building with Dining for Women. So as you're thinking about all the things that have been said here, using social media to spread the word about our cause. I see a lot of people taking pictures. I hope you will also share amongst your social networks, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. A lot of our demographic still uses Facebook. So spread the word because, I know. So the key is, this is part of us. One of our primary goals at Dining for Women is to continue to grow. And one of the reasons we want to continue to grow, in addition to raising more funds to deploy, we view that a big part of our mission is creating what we are calling global citizens. Yes. We are creating thousands of people who are more aware. Most of us would consider, we live in privilege in the United States, and a lot of us might live in just a little teeny tiny bit of a bubble. And so for us to bring in the stories of the challenges being faced by women and girls around the world and engage our brains about how we can be part of positive change, and then quite naturally, some of the ripple effects do start to come down into who I saw at our local March for Our Lives in Greenville, South Carolina. So it is all of a piece. So just, I'm encouraging, we are building a movement as well. So these tactics and things that we are talking about are important for Dining for Women as you go forward. So I think everyone can see how incredible this whole weekend is going to be. A huge thank you to everyone on our panel.
You'll be heading downstairs for lunch, so I just want to move you to.
Thank you all. I just want to tell you that